The global economy runs on fossilized carbon. We burn coal to generate electricity, process steel, and power manufacturing. But if you look closely at the chemical structure of that fuel, you are actually looking at the compressed remains of an ancient alien biology, a biology that violates almost every rule of how modern plants are supposed to grow. That biology thrived during the Carboniferous period, a stretch of deep time between 360 and 300 million years ago. Back then, North America and Europe sat on the equator, locked together under a dense, ultra-humid tropical climate. We only know about this world because of the Industrial Revolution. Workers digging deep underground for coal began pulling up massive, strangely patterned fossils from the rock walls. They were mining fuel, but they were unearthing the anatomy of an extinct ecosystem. The fossils belong to the apex canopy species of the Carboniferous wetlands, the arborescent lycopsids, often called scale trees. These organisms stood over 100 feet tall, dominating the skyline. Despite their immense size, these were not trees in the botanical sense. They were actually giant relatives of modern club mosses and quillworts. To reach heights of 100 feet, these scale plants utilized a bizarre structural workaround. That specific, highly flawed architecture would eventually dictate the ecology of the entire era and shape the evolutionary future of the animals living beneath them. To understand the flaw, we have to live inside. A modern oak's bifacial cambium produces a thick inner core of wood and outer phloem, but a lepidodendron's unifacial cambium produced a tiny, insignificant core of wood and zero secondary phloem. Without a robust woody interior, the scale tree had almost no internal rigidity. A column of soft pith cannot hold itself up against wind. The lycopsids solved this by pushing the structural load to its exterior, relying on a continuously expanding layer of periderm, or bark, up to 15 centimeters thick. As the trunk expanded radially, the exterior stretched, leaving tightly packed diamond-shaped leaf scars spiraling up the entire length of the column, giving the fossils their distinctive reptilian scale texture. Unlike the dead, brown bark of a modern oak, this thick exterior was completely alive. It consisted of green, photosynthetic tissue, dotted with stomata, microscopic pores actively pulling in carbon dioxide. The dominant life form of the Carboniferous was essentially a giant, rigid tube of green bark surrounding a soft, watery core. It was an elegant engineering solution for rapid vertical growth in a dense swamp, but it left the plant extremely vulnerable. The unifacial cambium created an immediate physiological crisis. Because it produced no secondary phloem, the scale tree lacked the internal vascular highway required to transport sugars generated in the high canopy down into the soil. Modern root systems are massive energy sinks. They require a constant supply of downward-flowing carbohydrates to grow and function. Without that supply line, the lycopsids could not grow true roots. Instead, they anchored themselves in the swamp mud using a completely different structure called stigmata, an extensive, branching subterranean network. Developmentally, these stigmaria rhizomorphs were actually modified stems. They exhibited primary growth patterns identical to the upward-reaching trunk. To survive without sugars from the canopy, the rhizomorphs absorbed their own nutrients. They pushed out hundreds of lateral rootlets from circular attachment scars. These rootlets were technically modified leaves, built to absorb water, minerals, and sunlight. Because the upper portions of the stigmaria network sat exposed above the shallow mudline, they remained green and actively photosynthesized to feed the entire underground system. The arborescent lycopsid was a closed-loop organism. From the bifurcating branches of its crown all the way down to the mud, it was a continuous, green, photosynthesizing tube. It was perfectly optimized for the Carboniferous wetlands, but it was physically tethered to the presence of constant surface water. This strange anatomy was paired with a rapid, expendable life cycle. Most scale trees were monocarpic. They grew aggressively for a decade, reproduced in a single massive event, and immediately died. A living sigillaria would have looked like a towering green pole, suddenly erupting into dense, bottle-brush-like clusters of foliage at the very top right before its reproductive phase. When the plant died, taphonomy took over. The soft, watery pith at the core of the tree decayed almost instantly, leaving only the rigid, 15-centimeter-thick cylinder of bark standing upright in the mud. These standing hollow tubes created the Joggins paradox. Paleontologists excavating fossilized lycopsid stumps in Nova Scotia found the skeletons of early tetrapods, amphibians, and the earliest known amniotes perfectly entombed inside the vehicle trunks. For over a century, the prevailing scientific explanation was the pitfall theory, championed by early geologists like J.W. Dawson.
They assumed these animals were hapless victims, falling into the open tops of buried stumps and starving to death. Modern paleontological analysis refutes the trap hypothesis. These fossil skeletons occur alongside charcoal in nearly every instance, a detail that points away from accidental entrapment and toward a specific environmental trigger. During the Carboniferous, seasonal dry periods sparked localized wildfires. These fires burned through the swamps, cutting deep notches into the bases of the hollow, dead trunks, opening up ground-level entrances. Rather than falling from the top, millipedes, early amphibians, and small reptiles actively crawled into these fire-scarred hollows to escape predators, shelter from the environment, and den. These animals were members of the earliest known tree hollow ecological guild. The specific biomechanical flaws of the scale trees, their rapid internal rot and thick, rigid bark, directly engineered early terrestrial animal behavior, providing the physical architecture for a new ecological niche. While scale trees supported animal life and death, their survival relied on an archaic reproductive strategy. They did not produce seeds. Instead, they dispersed elaborate, encapsulated spores from cone-like structures. This heterosporous reproduction was physically bound to water. Free-living male microspores had to physically swim through an ambient fluid environment to fertilize the female megaspores. This fragile dependency set the stage for a catastrophic tipping point, the Carboniferous rainforest collapse, an event that struck roughly 307 million years ago. This graph tracks global humidity against amphibian and lycopsid diversity between 360 and 290 million years ago. At the 307 million year mark, a sudden shift in global climate causes humidity to drop off a cliff, and the diversity metrics crash simultaneously. The arborescent lycopsids were entirely unequipped to adapt. Their ununifacial trunks lacked the deep-water transport systems needed to pull moisture from drying soil, and their monocarpic, spore-based reproduction failed completely without standing surface water. The great equatorial rainforests collapsed. Millions of giant, rigid bark tubes died and fell into the receding swamps, compressing under sediment to form the massive coal seams that power modern human industry. The Carboniferous rainforest collapse acted as a massive biological filter. In a newly dry world, survival was restricted to organisms capable of retaining their own moisture. The ecological vacuum left by the dead scale trees was rapidly filled by a different lineage of plants, gymnosperms and seed ferns. By replacing swimming spores with hardy, self-contained seeds, these plants could successfully reproduce in arid soils, allowing them to colonize deep inland territories far beyond the river embankments. A parallel evolutionary filter swept through the animal kingdom. The large amphibians died out alongside the swamps, while a smaller group of amniotes thrived. Looking back at the diversity graph, two new trend lines emerge at 307 million years. As the climate dries, amniote and seed plant diversity branch outward and rise rapidly. The amniotes possessed a critical evolutionary advantage. By laying encapsulated eggs, they effectively carried their own private ocean with them, severing the physical tether to the shrinking wetlands. The biomechanical failure and extinction of the Carboniferous scale trees cleared the ecological real estate required for amniotes to radiate, triggering the evolutionary lineage that leads directly to modern reptiles, mammals, and us.